Welcome to the Jackson Rudolph podcast. I'm your host, Jackson Rudolph, and this is episode 65, brought to you by the one and only, the legendary Black Belt Magazine. And speaking of legendary, do we have a show for you today? We have Team Paul Mitchell member. You might know him as Liu Kang from the Mortal Kombat live tour. You might know him as Kid Carmichael, but sport karate fans should know him as Carmichael Simon, a sport karate innovator, one of the greatest forms competitors of all time, with a wide variety of talents that we're going to be diving into today. Carmichael, it's an honor to have you on the show, man. I really appreciate you taking the time. And for our Black Belt Magazine audience that maybe isn't as familiar with sport karate and your story and your background, maybe just introduce yourself a little bit more and tell us, how did this whole martial arts journey start for you?
Absolutely. First and foremost, thank you, Jackson, for having me here. This is a great opportunity. I think this is something for myself in general, putting the lineage of Grandmaster Rhee, as well as the legacy of our sport, and documenting this in Black Belt Magazine is quite the honor. I started, martial arts, probably very similar to a lot of kids who do start, being inspired by television, media, as well as, the typical growing up as a child, being a small kid, it was for self-defense. But in reality, it ended up becoming something that became my lifestyle. And most importantly, to give back to a community that I've always appreciated and loved during my time as not only a competitor, but now as a mentor to our community. And, I come from a small town in Maryland called Annapolis, Maryland. Many would not know at that time, a lot of great martial artists come out of the DMV area, the Washington, D.C., Virginia, Maryland area. And it's, a lot of the influence in that area is primarily Grandmaster Jhoon, and did have the opportunity to find him later in my journey of martial arts. But I did start my martial arts as a Taekwondo artist, doing traditional ITF. And that was basically the techniques and the foundation that led to me receiving my first black belt at 9 years old.
Very cool. And that was one of the things that I wanted to get into with your background. You mentioned Grandmaster Rhee and you mentioned starting in ITF Taekwondo. But when people go on YouTube and they look up your videos and they see some of your old performances, you can find some Wushu, some Kung Fu, some Chinese broadsword in the weapons division, stuff like that. We're going to get into that more later. But it's interesting to know your start was in Taekwondo and then the other styles came in after that, correct?
Absolutely. And my first master, his name is Peter Kokinos. And he's a PhD, I believe, and well, he is a PhD at Rutgers, and at the time he was at University of Maryland doing kinesiology and sports education. So it was nice because when I started martial arts, it was primarily for education purposes, and that was the structure that I was raised around, was to learn about short-term goals and long-term goals to achieve a black belt, right? Especially a child at 4 or 5 years old. They don't know everything else and all the opportunities that you could do with the martial arts. But as you know, it's, being a prodigy as yourself, right? As well as continuing on as you grow in a future family, it's like you want to be able to pass that on. And that's what martial arts has really taught me, is how to set short-term and long-term goals in life.
And that's something that I feel like is the underrated aspect of martial arts that people don't talk about enough, is the goal setting, both short-term and long-term, as you mentioned, that you get just from stepping onto a mat for the first time and getting your white belt and seeing that you could be a black belt. That teaches kids so much about goal setting that you don't get really in any other sport, because it's like, you focus on win the game or whatever, but there's no long-term vision unless the kid wants to try to go to like the NBA or the NFL. But even that is a reach, right? In martial arts, every student has an opportunity to set and achieve both short-term and long-term goals. And I think that we could go down a rabbit hole and talk about that for hours on end. But one thing that's really interesting is, because I came from a traditional WTF Taekwondo, now known as WT, World Taekwondo program. You started in traditional ITF. We both found sport karate, which looks nothing like either of those styles of Taekwondo, right? Certainly there's influence at times, but sport karate in and of itself is its own unique style, right? And so everybody has these kind of weird, crazy stories as how they got initially involved in competition. how was your starting competition? What was your first tournament, and how did that come to be?
Yeah, this was interesting. I mean, I've always, I guess, for one, was always, I knew martial arts was going to be part of my life somehow, some way. And I enjoyed the discipline of the martial arts. I also enjoyed the belt ranking system because it allowed me, like you said, the short-term and long-term goals. It so happened that I didn't start competition until I received my black belt. And it just so happened that there was a flyer at the martial arts school. We didn't train for competition. We trained for ranking and the traditional aspects of it. And you have to remember, this is in the 80s. So a lot of the media side of it was just blossoming, the Karate Kid, watching Ernie Jr. do side kicks. So there was, some pull through with regards to, okay, this could be part of film and media. And just from looking at Black Belt Magazine and Karate Kung Fu Illustrated, that's where a lot of the, you go to the, your local store and you'd be able to pick up a martial arts magazine. And that's where you learned about the heroes of the martial arts. And the heroes weren't entertainers. The heroes were competitors. And at the school, we saw this flyer and there was a local tournament in the Baltimore area. And that was my first tournament. I did horrible for obvious reasons. It's just a discipline. You learn the discipline, you learn the format, and you learn the environment. And that really showed me how to adapt. So that was, one opportunity. And the second tournament I went to was actually in '86. It was Capital Classics. And I was amazed. I saw Billy Blanks perform with Ernie Jr. for a demo. I saw Kiyotaro Bayashi, perform. And actually, I think he beat Charlie Lee, that night. And it was such an amazing opportunity. And, the nighttime show has always been something that has always, to this day, I believe, I hope, is the place that our competitors can gravitate and see the vision and the imagination of what amazing high-level competitors have the opportunity to do. And having those relationships that pass down was something that I was really fascinated with. And that's where I got hooked, was a nighttime show. And then you quickly learn that there's like all these other divisions, and then you have to go through round one runoffs and round two runoffs. And eventually, if you go to a tournament that only allows the top 3 competitors, hopefully you squeeze it down. So, you go through those cycles, but it was definitely meeting the heroes and having the ability to have the conversation, sort of like for our relationship. I'm a bridge to one generation. You're a bridge to another generation. For us to be able to bridge just allows each other to travel through our journeys through the martial arts.
And that's something else that I feel like people don't talk about often enough, is the accessibility of the highest level sport karate athletes. If you're in basketball or football and you look up to the pros, your chances of ever having a conversation with them are slim to none. Maybe you get like a high five and an autograph at a game, right? But with sport karate, granted, smaller pond, but still, those highest level professional sport karate athletes, you can walk up to them at a tournament. If you're above 18, you can register in their division and go compete against them. You can share the ring with them, right? And that's something that I think is so cool and so unique about sport karate, that more martial artists who are getting started in sport karate should take advantage of, is the opportunity to interact with these people, learn from these people, right? You can't book a private lesson for basketball with LeBron James.
That's
you
right.
can't book a private lesson with Carmichael Simon or whoever, you know what I mean? And that's something that I think is so valuable about sport karate. Now, ultimately, I want to get into talking about your Paul Mitchell story, because clearly I'm a Paul Mitchell guy, but there's a whole lot in between first tournament not being very good and getting to Paul Mitchell. So in between those moments, when was it that you realized that this was something you could be one of the best in the world at? Was it a big win? Was it maybe a lesson that you taught, or maybe a loss that you took, but you realized you were close? What was that moment for you where you're like, wait a minute, I'm good at this?
Yes, I would say, I would say first is humility, right? And I use it, because that's what martial arts teaches. And I've never learned from success. I learned from failure. So losing at these tournaments, and I wouldn't say it was bad, but yeah, it was pretty bad. It provided me the determination and guidance. So, very similar to this time, you had to reach out and find coaches. And, sport karate coaches, even though, yes, they're accessible and you can find them, you're only dealing with maybe 10, 10 out of the best out of 100 national competitors. But if you really want the elite, you have to get to the point, like you said, to have the accessibility in the conversation, to know that you are going to be mentored and or anointed by this master, right? So it took some time, right? So from 9 years old to 12 years old, I competed at a regional circuit. And this was competing against Ricardo Royale, Michael Saxon, John Valera, Seneca Luther. And this was in the inception of Karate Helps Kick Diabetes team, right? You had Smash and you had Karate Helps Kick Diabetes in the mid to late 80s. So I was able to go to a few tournaments at the time. Obviously, I was not sponsored, but I was able to go to Atlantic City, for example, for the top 10 nationals, or Capital Classics, or Empire State Nationals. And that was pretty much the region I stayed in, was a DMV in the New York metropolitan area. But it allowed me to see, and Peter Lende. So I would go to New York, I would see Peter Lende. I'd go to Virginia, I'd see John Valera and Michael Saxon. So I was able to see a lot of great competitors, and that's what I wanted to emulate. So to be in the same conversations as them now, it's very much a privilege. But I ended up, getting to a point that I competed, and Charlie Lee had a summer camp in 1989. And he did a summer camp with, obviously at the time, Arlene Lemus won the gold in 88. Steve Nasty Anderson was a best point fighter. I think, the 8th or 9th wonder of the world, as they would call him. And, Charlie Lee, one of the greatest forms competitors of all time, right? Through the lineage of John Chung and Grandmaster Rhee. So Friday night, he does Exodus, and I fall in love with Exodus, right? And obviously that is the first musical martial arts ballet form ever, right? And the next day he does Twilight Zone. And then we close the camp and he does Fire on Ice, which is his new competition form. And during this time, I'm watching this and I'm seeing this progression of choreography. And I'm seeing the way that he's breaking out the 7 qualities of a champion. Power, posture, quickness, timing, endurance, flexibility, and balance. But he's breaking out these sections. We're working through each element, and then he's fusing all 7 with a switch punch or a flying side kick. And I'm like, wow, like you can actually do a movement and put them all together. Because, I'm coming from a traditional aspect, and you only think that you just do power, or this student only has quickness, or this student only has balance. But he was fusing so much, I fell in love with the choreography. And that's the second opportunity 3 years later, from 86 to 89, was I wanted to commit and do the national circuit. And in 1990, I had the opportunity to compete. In 89, quite honestly, after that camp in August, I did 10 private lessons with Charlie. And he's like, we're going to prepare for the Diamonds in 89. And I went to the Diamonds, and that platform was amazing. I mean, one would say, like in tennis, we have our Grand Slams. But each tournament has its own feeling. It has its own theme. It has its own audience. And the Diamonds, in retrospect to the conversation that you had with Master Carnahan around retirement, that is actually not just retirement, that is the platform, because you've already gone through a series of tournaments the entire year. But that tournament is sort of where you show all the mistakes. You're starting to re-choreograph your form for this diamond ring. And to be able to see that tournament and compete with the best and watch Charlie retire and then become the commissioner of NASCA, I realized this is not just the opportunity for competition, but if I was graced with that platform to perform on the Diamonds or any national tournament like the Battle of Atlanta, US Open, or Bluegrass, I was going to make sure that when I competed and shared my choreography, I've always remembered my time in 1989 in that camp when Charlie Lee broke down choreography. And you can contest to this as one that travels, is you have so many students that you mentor and emulate. And some of them emulate you to the T, but it's only when you find those students that are able to create and readapt and evolve your vision and imagine for themselves is where you show yourself like now your base is now you become the ceiling to somebody else's new foundation. And that's what I enjoyed watching through, my time as a student, and I'll always be a student, but most importantly within the circuit as a competitor.
That is so cool. And you talk about Diamonds. I mean, even up through the 2010s, that Diamonds crowd was always electric. And it was because it was almost as if everybody in the room had an understanding of what that moment meant. Even in divisions, oftentimes you'd be in the heat of a points race, right? Oftentimes Diamonds would determine who was going to win the NASCAR World Championship. And then after you get through divisions, then you got to worry about trying to go and win your diamond ring, right? So there's so many layers to it. And there's certain tournaments where I feel like you can feel the history in the room, right? Like I feel that at Diamonds. I feel that at US Open in the Coronado. I feel that at AKA Warrior Cup. These certain tournaments, you feel the history of the event kind of leading up to that moment in which you take the stage, right? And another thing that I find really interesting that I want to touch on a little bit more is clearly you were heavily influenced by Charlie Lee, which is a name that has a ton of influence in modern sport karate, but so many of the kids nowadays don't know that name. They don't know the name Charlie Lee other than if they maybe listened to me and gone on YouTube and watched videos and been like, oh, Charlie Lee Nationals, who's Charlie, right? Exactly. And so Charlie Lee, a lot of people don't realize this. He was the one who famously coined the phrase, Flash is trash without the basics. Like that was Charlie Lee's thing. So maybe just talk a little bit more about his legacy, and then we'll dive into some more of your career.
Yes, I mean it's everything coming from martial ballet. I look at it like basketball, right? And if you think of the analogy of basketball and the person who threw the first jump shot, I would say that Charlie was that jump shot. And John Chung was a great kicker, and during the 80s, it was John Chung and Jean Fournette. Everybody was kickers. However, the dynamic explosion of choreography and flying in the air came from two individuals. And for me, was Charlie Lee and Stephen Ho. One went to the media route, which was Stephen, and Charlie continued to, as a lawyer, provide back to our circuits. So Flash's trash without basics was to make sure that whenever you did your form, you maintained the integrity and authenticity of martial arts. And it didn't matter what style or discipline you did, but you kept the rooted foundation of the philosophical aspects of self-defense. But could you be able to apply it and showcase your techniques so that a general bystander who's still learning martial arts or consumer could watch a dynamic performance to music, acoustically, and visually to appreciate martial arts? And what that foundation allows you to now put your character into it. How do you deliver it as a competitor? And that delivery is taking the foundation and then overlaying that with your flash. Similar to what you do as a bow competitor, and have you been able to take bow tricking or even standard bow techniques to another level, similar to tricking in an empty hand form of view. And that's has always, kept us pretty solid within the circuit. And even to this day, I know that is how our sport is defined. And thinking back of, like I said, with Master Carnahan, it's sort of like the 2-point kick to the body, right? The donkey kick doesn't work, but if you do a full leg extension, give them the point, right? We know where execution, we can visually see. And if you can acoustically hear that impact, you got to put the 2 points. So very similar, Flash is trash without basics. And it was something that we trained and we were always cognizant and aware of that as competitors.
And that is so important, because I feel like a lot of young competitors today, they look at who's at the top or who's been at the top before, and they get impressed by the tricks over the years, right? Whether it was in the weapons division, right? Whether they were looking at my bow form and seeing those tricks, or Kalman's double sword releases, or Matt Emick's chuck manipulation, or Rudy Raynon's comma manipulation, back to Valera's comma manipulation, right? And I feel like these young competitors look at those videos and they get enamored by the tricks, but what they don't realize is that in each of those generations, there were other competitors that could also do those tricks. Now, maybe those competitors who really made it were the ones who innovated or invented those tricks. But the reason that they had the platform to innovate and invent those techniques was because they were rewarded for solid basics first. And that's what made them a winner. And then they became, somebody that can be remembered off of the tricks that they innovated. And that is a flow of logic that I think gets missed in a lot of young competitors. And I'm sure we'll get more philosophical about tournament strategies and what's good and what's not as we go deeper into this. But now I want to get to another specific moment for you, because it seems like everybody that's been on Paul Mitchell has their Paul Mitchell story, right? Like the story surrounding how they actually got put onto the team. So you talk about being inspired by Charlie Lee, you travel the national circuit, you start getting some wins, and you ultimately get noticed by Paul Mitchell. What's that story of how you got on the team?
I was very fortunate because I got picked up for WMAC Masters when I was a junior at 17 years old, in 1994, at the Battle of Atlanta. And I believe I was groomed to be part of that team. As a junior, I was with Metro All-Stars, and that was a great team to leverage to be able to move to the adult competition. And, Paul Mitchell did not have a junior team at the time. So that was, sort of getting a black belt in competition, right? And knowing that the majority of our cast was Paul Mitchell, right? There was a good synergy with, Master Pat Johnson and Master Rodriguez and the coaches. It was just a good, perfect fit. So I do remember, I was either on tour. Actually, I was probably finishing WMAC Masters at 94. And as I was entering into 95, I received that call from the team and was like, would you like to be part of Paul Mitchell? And I was like, obviously, absolutely, and my predecessors at the time, obviously, was Mike Chat, right? So Mike Chat was opening the door to be that first junior to cross over into the adult division. And it was one of those times when, the triumphant, as you've noted, is provided us an opportunity to unify, to collaborate and help harness the sport from a junior competition, which really, I believe, harnessed NASCA to a media platform of martial arts, which was the triumphant of martial arts entertainers before we exited Y2K, ending Y2K, and then we're becoming into this, a new generation of competitors of triggers. So I'm not saying it was perfectly choreographed, but I just believe it was meant to be, and the relationships were already built at that time, and they knew how to scout talent, and I believe that's what Paul Mitchell has always done very well, was a scout talent. I remember Julie being the director of marketing at the time, to the point, VP running the company in general, pretty much, for DeJoria. So, you watch people grow and you watch competitors grow. And going back to the Charlie Lee situation, the process is, many of the martial arts is a process, as you noted. And as a competitor, you want to give back. You're giving back in a media platform with one of the leading magazine, and company for 50 plus years per se. I'm just saying sport karate in general. But Charlie ended up training talent, having tournaments, and providing additional opportunities. And that's what Paul Mitchell did for me. It provided me opportunities and provided me with a great family. As I look back, 26 years, 25, 26 years later, I still have the best relationships with you all.
And I think that that's one thing that is so special about Paul Mitchell's legacy, is not just that Paul Mitchell has always had the top competitors on the circuit since, the late 80s, early 90s, right? But there's also the fact that at some point it became an achievement to get on Paul Mitchell. It wasn't just like getting sponsored by a team and, you could kind of have your pick between this team or that team sponsoring you and who are you loyal to. But for a while, and even still today, if you got the call from Paul Mitchell, there was a mutual understanding that that was a higher level achievement that anybody would go pursue regardless of what team you were on previously. And that's what I think makes Paul Mitchell the greatest team legacy in the history of sport karate, right? And so, and the other great thing that Paul Mitchell did is they always had all of the best. It wasn't just like the one best guy against like the two others from other teams. It was typically the top 3 to 5 guys, at least in the men's division, and typically the top 1 or 2 females in the women's division were on Team Paul Mitchell. And that is the perfect segue to what I've always called the Great Triumvirate, which was that mid-90s era of Paul Mitchell. That was yourself, John Valera, and Mike Chat, going for every overall grand, forms, weapons, didn't matter, major championships, U.S. Opens, diamonds, and everything in between. So just speak a little bit to that and competing alongside those two and how the three of you all made each other better.
Wow, that's deep, and I can go for days. But to summarize it is going back to the beginning of this conversation was about failure and knowing your weaknesses and appreciating the strengths of your other competitors. I knew I did not have hands like John Valera. I did not have the quickness as John Valera. I did not have the balance and dexterity, agility, and flexibility as Mike Chat. However, with the inspiration of Charlie's basics and Stephen Ho's flash, and watching Ho-Sung compete and Keith Hirabayashi and Richard Brandon, and to have the background to not only be a hardstyle artist, but a soft style artist, gave me the opportunity to sit back and say, how can I actually compete at a level to them? And that's where the initial fusion happened, was combining what I like to call American division or American freestyle, is bridging the hard style and the soft style together to create what we know now as, sport karate per se. And I had to find all the choreography from every piece of form that I knew on both styles. I remember going to tournaments as a junior leading up to 18 years old. And remember, your best performances, people just feel like that 55 or 60 seconds that you can do it all the time. No, it led from that first time that you did a kick or a punch to what the audience is seeing when you're winning a grand. And like that is a decade or two, or a decade and a half per se for myself. And with that, to be able to bridge it and to be able to compete at that level was a privilege for me. And I needed to know how I, like I said, compete against them, but most importantly, how can I give back? And to be able to execute some very difficult maneuvers were in the imagination. And that was conversations with Ernie Jr. That was training with Stephen Ho and Charlie Lee and my sports conditioning coach, Francis Pineda. And I only competed as an adult for 1 year. And that's it. It was, I did my duty. All I want to do is win the Triple Crown, which was, the Diamonds Bluegrass, the Diamonds US Open and the battle. And I knew that was my time. And I would say for all of us, we've pushed each other to where we are now as men. We were able to compete as juniors and re-choreograph our form and find our most favorite sections. Like I can still remember the sections that Mike Chat does or the sections that John does. You're just moving things around. Or there's a different switch here, or he's turning this way, or someone's doing an extra punch, or chop. It's typically, somebody's body dynamics. And I can still remember vividly that we got to a point that we helped each other out, that when we were on the team together, we were able to showcase the best choreography. But that took years as a junior, perfecting that and finding what was the best sections for us to captivate the audience and to push this sport forward.
And you mentioned the body dynamics, which I think is really interesting because you watch Valera and Chat and yourself. And one of the things that was most entertaining about the grands that had all three of you in them is that you were all so different, right? You all had very different ways of performing, right? And you mentioned some of the attributes of each of them, right? With Chad, it was the cleanliness and the flexibility, and with Valera was the speed of his hands and everything that he put into his performance. So there have been deep debates, right? About, Carmichael was the best, or no, Chad was the best, or Valera was the best, right? So from your perspective as one of the competitors in that division, and maybe it's not Chad or Valera, because you were also against great soft style competitors, Richard Brandon and the like, so on and so forth, right? As a competitor in that division in that 1995 season, who was it that most consistently earned your respect? Who was it that you were like, this is the person that is most likely to beat me. This is who I need to train for? And maybe it's a tie between a couple of people. I'll give you an out in that way. But what's your response to that?
It was here. This is interesting because I was in the American division, and it was David Douglas.
Oh, interesting. Go on.
So it was, yes. So sometimes what people don't see is how you got there to even step on stage. So David actually is the one in my division that pushed me, because if I did not train at that level, I would not have had the opportunity to be on stage. Mm-hmm. Right. So if I could pass through David, I already knew I had the grand, put it that way.
That's
so, and it's just, and it was because things were changing at that time. Remember, we're coming out of a generation of kickers, and we're coming out of a generation of hand technique experts like Charlie Lee, but we're coming into a generation of flyer, acro kickers. Stephen Ho was still influencing at the time, even though he wasn't competing. Ho Sung Pak retired, but he was coming. But everything was very media centric at the time. So, but David was the one that was that new West Coast flavor and the Kim Does of the world. Yeah. That really, quite honestly, the West Coast team and that whole next generation team really is the pinnacle of sport karate at the creative level. And I will always give them their due respects. I love Ernie Jr. and Ernie Sr. I'm even though I'm Bruce Lee, I love Bruce Lee, I love Shannon. I love, what has been contributed through his time in the enterprise. I've always been fascinated with Ernie Jr. And I still have, he's my mentor. He's a very close friend. He's one of my best friends. And, to have the conversation as well continues to inspire me. So I have to make sure I give respect to that family and what they've done for sport karate, because those competitors really pushed us. However, if I look at it, if they were all on John Paul Mitchell and the whole West Coast team was on NASCA, it actually happened, if you think about it, in the mid 2000s when Luke Kicks was there. Mm-hmm. Things really changed when the byproducts of West Coast came into the circuit. And I have to, give you that detail, because that divisional win and that time with David Douglas, and as he became a former teammate or teammate of ours as well. So I hats off to him, and I appreciate him pushing me as well, even though nobody saw him a lot on stage until after the fact.
Right, absolutely. And that's something that I want to make sure that our audience is aware of, because the reason that I didn't when you said David Douglas, I was like, wait a minute, that makes so much sense, because in today's competition with the creative musical extreme breakdown, as opposed to what it used to be with the American division and the Korean division and so on and so forth, today, all of the competitors you see in grands compete against each other in the divisions already. So we're beating each other to try to get in the grands. Whereas back in the day, to an extent, each of the people in the grands kind of had their own division that they kind of ruled over and used that to get to the grands. And so that is a very, very different dynamic where, David Douglas, which very interesting. You talk about kind of that evolution. That's an extremely interesting stylistic matchup, because after this podcast, I encourage everybody, go watch some David Douglas forms, the massive D legs, the high flying tricks. that was that first new wave of, like you said, kind of like big air tricking that was in contrast to the kick focus tricking that had been popular with you and Valera and so on and so forth, right? So I could nerd out about that all day, because that's such an interesting, like, multi-layered situation that was going on there. So going on to that grand, right? Because even though you say Douglas was your biggest challenge in that grand, obviously in front of big crowds and going for the money and everything else, do you remember a tournament where you and Chat and Valera all hit? Maybe other people were in the division too. Everybody hit, and it was just everybody's at their best and nobody knew who was going to win it, right? Do you remember any tournaments like that where it was just like one of the best divisions you've ever been a part of?
Obviously, it's going to go back to 95 Bluegrass. It's just the one.
You can find on YouTube, by the way. I want everybody to go search that up. You can see all three of their performances. Go ahead.
Yeah. So here's what's interesting. So I'm on tour at the time. So I'm doing my form every night on Mortal Kombat live tour. Okay. And I'm also filming WMAC at the same time. So I'm not coming into the situation as a competitor. This has now become my life as a performer. So my endurance level is very high. It's sort of like competing at Mile High Classics. Like, you have to get your cardio up to it. But if you're doing shows every night, it just becomes second nature, right? So I go on stage, and before I step on stage, talking to two of my best friends, Larry Chang and Chad McLemore, and like, watch this. This is for you all, and this is for the crowd. I go up and I hit my combo. From my understanding, Mike Chat was turned around at the time. And John Valera's watching the combo, the super combo happen. And he goes, "What just happened?" He goes, don't worry about it, bro. Like, just go up there and do your form." And remember, Mike had the most precise Street Fighter choreographed form to the T. I mean, it was so precise.
Perfect.
It was equivalent to Grandmaster Rhee's Exodus. Like, that's how to the T he choreographed that form. So he turns around, he does his form, and since he didn't see it, he didn't know what to expect. So that is the part where you look at a competitor, and some competitors like to watch competitors, some don't. Mike wasn't one that, at times, it depends. He didn't watch the competitor because he was going up next. So he was, in meditation mode, and John was like, he goes, "What did he do?" He goes, "I don't know." But all he can hear is the crowd from the beginning of the form to the end at this interval that just peaked straight up like a hockey puck. And it just kept going higher until I stepped off the stage. And, as you can see in the video, it's just people were just standing and applauding because they knew, and I felt it too. I was like, this is it. Like, if I'm going to do this form the way that I want to do it, with the training and representing our community as an entertainer, is like, I'm going to put it all out right now. And it just so happened everything in serendipity just all came together at the time. That's all I can say. And that's where, they could re-choreograph, but it pushed John and Mike to re-choreograph. So you think about when that happened, and then you're watching John evolve to blonde hair, combos are moving quite fast, cut off gis. Mike has moved into Wizard. Now he's coming in with his theme. And it started to create this, the tournament was not just the theme, but it was also the competitor became the hero again. They became iconic again. And that's where it was, that was an amazing time. And that was the amazing tournament. Yeah.
That is such a cool perspective. And that's something that I always preach is I'm like, watch your competitors, take in what's happening so that you can put your best foot forward and know what adjustments to make in your form. But a lot of competitors don't like to make adjustments. They like to just have their plan and go execute the plan. So that strategic aspect of it and the fact that Chat didn't see what you did is such an interesting dynamic there. So for everybody watching that obviously wasn't there and doesn't know this, what was the order? Was it you first and then Chat and then Valera? Had Valera already gone? What was the order there?
I went up first.
Uh-huh.
So myself, Chat, then Valera closed. But remember, there were competitors in between. So there was still Gabe Renaga. There's still Steve Torres. There was still Richard Brandon. right? There was other competitors in between us. So it was pretty much either lock it down and hopefully the scores come up the way it is or not. Here's a fun fact. 7 judges, I got 5 10s and 2 9-9s. Guess who gave me the 9-9s? I'll tell you. Master John Chung and Master Charlie Lee.
Ah, interesting. Now, did they give 10s to somebody else, or was 9 their winning score?
That was it. They left it on 9s or 9-8s.
Uh-huh.
So my understanding is that at the time, for example, to be a legendary forms competitor, you would never give a 10. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Later in life, you know, as the sport evolved, my understanding is, like, for example, Charlie did give 10s. But at that time, when things were evolving, we typically didn't give 10s out at the time. And I respect
sometimes we get 10s too often nowadays. But
right.
Anyway, and it's interesting because Charlie Lee was kind of notoriously not a tough judge is unfair, but I've heard stories before of, like, you know, Paul Mitchell members, people that are of high caliber, you know, competitors, and then Charlie Lee giving a 9-8 to that competitor as the winning score. Like, he wouldn't give a 9-9 because he was like, yeah, you won the division, but I've seen better from you, so you're not getting the 9 this time. And so I think that philosophy is so interesting. And I mean, it's unfortunate that you could have probably gotten all 10s for that form, and it was still that way at the time. But anyway, so one of the things that helped you, obviously, with that performance was, as you called it, the super combo, right? One of the first long 4 or 5 move tricking combinations that had been done in competition. And you earned a reputation as an innovator within sport karate, right? And so I want to talk about a specific moment first, other than that Bluegrass, and then we'll get more general. You were also the first person, and a lot of modern competitors do know this fact, fortunately. You were the first person to throw the 720, and that was at the Battle of Atlanta. I believe it was 95, if I'm not mistaken, 94, sorry. So you were the first person to throw 720. What made you do it? Because if that was 94, were you still a junior? So what was the factor that you were like, I need to throw this?
Yes. So 1990, my first year competing, I get to sit down and talk to Ernie Jr. At the Battle of Atlanta. And we were just chatting about what the future of the sport was. And we were basically visualizing and going through imagination of what's it like to jump up in the air and rotate. And he was talking about switchblades and jackknives and 720s. And he was, at the time, that's when the 540 first came out. So we were still trying to figure that out. Fortunately, I was able to, because of my Wushu background. And obviously that's when a lot of fusing of hybriding of martial arts styles began, per se. So it was more of imagination and conversation. But by 94, knowing that WMAC Masters was coming to the show, I wanted to make sure, and every tournament was about bringing out a new piece of choreography or bringing out a new move. And I remember training the rotation, but not the actual kick. And if you remember Battle at the time, and you can watch it back on footage, it gets really dark and the lighting is really different inside that arena. So you'll see clips of lights getting shut off, unfortunately, big spotlights hitting you from different directions. But, I felt as though that was the moment, and I felt prepared. And I do remember, I can think about it vividly, throwing my axe kick and rotating and seeing the lights, and I sort of blacked out because it was just so fast that I didn't really throw it. And I threw the hook kick, and I planted, and I landed. And I had to give that all up to one thing, the basics. And because if I did not know where my pinky toe was or my big toe was, people don't understand, when you get to the detail of a martial artist, your feet control how you move on stage or on the floor. And anything could happen. And the whole forms, as you know, is not, it's always cleaning up detail through your form. You don't want to make mistakes, but you're always making mistakes in your form, but you're constantly cleaning, through repetition and through your form. So with that, throwing the kick was the most amazing feeling hitting the floor. And actually the crowd went silent because when I stepped off stage, Hakeem came up to me, he goes, "What was that?" And I was like, "It's a 720. He goes, "Break that down for me." He goes, "Well, you know, I do a jump spinning hook kick off of 2 feet from a back stance. And then you put that foot back, your right foot back, and you land." He's like, "Yes." I was like, "Think about if you jumped up and spun twice, then kicked, and then landed." He goes, "Oh my goodness." And then that's when, Carlin West and Pat Johnson and the team gave me my contract for WMAC Masters.
That is awesome.
That's
so
the
it really wasn't so much to try to win the competition as much as it was for the moment and knowing that the WMAC Masters guys were there. I think that's an interesting perspective that a lot of people don't realize is sometimes top competitors don't throw stuff in an attempt to win the division. Sometimes there's an outside reason beyond just trying to win that inspires us to throw something, which I think is really fascinating. So you said that you trained the rotation, but not really the kick. Was that 720 on stage the first one with the kick that you ever landed?
The first one, yes.
That's insane.
That's right. As well as the 95 Bluegrass. So the 95 Bluegrass breakdown is actually an evolution. So it started with the 540 in 1990. 91 or 92 era, I did 540 hook kick aerial. Just watching Kung Fu films. Like, you can watch old Kung Fu films with Jackie Chan throwing like a 540 hook kick. I was like, why don't I just go through it? And I do an aerial, right? And then from there, 93 Bluegrass was 540 hook kick butterfly twist in the grand. Because I was already twisting just from doing Wushu broadsword. So by 94, when the 540 dropped, the 720 dropped, I didn't know this, but the choreography that I set for 95 had the ability to bring all those elements together. So it wasn't a creation of this is what I'm going to throw. It was an evolution of training 540, a hook kick, an aerial, a 540, a hook kick, a butterfly twist, and a 720. And it's probably very similar to your combos. You come across certain movements and patterns and where your body adjusts and what feels right or where you want to pivot or where you think the audience is or the judges are, and you create your choreography from that line of sight. Now, it would be different if we had judges on 4 corners, right? It would be a whole different dynamic. It would be a really weird thing, but knowing if you're framing for film or you're framing for the judges, as a high-level competitor, that's where where to do your manipulations and your tricks, and then show your basic foundation through your choreography.
One thing that's blowing my mind a little bit right now is the parallelism and how spot on that you are with that assumption about my bow forms, and the parallelism between the development of bow trick combos and the development of what you termed the super combo that you did in 95 Bluegrass, right? Because that is how, like, a lot of the bow tricks that I've created, because that was something that I always prided myself on, was I'm not just going to do the hard tricks. I'm going to do tricks that I made up in my forms, right? And since 2011, I'd say 80% of the tricks that I've done in competition have been tricks that I was the one who created. But it started with, in 2010, I started doing the combo where I did a little 360 release, neck roll, behind the head catch, and then spin. I would do a 360 spin with my hands behind my head. And then the next season that evolved to be hands behind my head and then catch it behind my back. So what we call 540 goes from 360, add the half rotation for the behind the back catch. And then from there, I had to add to it, right? So like you talk about adding the aerial. From there, I came up with what I call the orbiter, which is the throw that I do where it goes from my left hip, bow goes around my body up to the left shoulder. That came after that 540 catch. And then from there, I was like, okay, well, people are doing more spins now. More people are catching doubles. More people are catching 2.5s. And then that 540 with my hands behind the head became what I would do as the triple spin in the adult division, right? And so it's so fascinating how it's literally the same type of evolution that inspired tricking in the 90s as well as bow tricks in the 2010s. That blows my mind. But anyway, we've got more interesting topics that we want to get to, so I'm not going to let myself go on about that for 3 hours.
Well, I mean, give yourself flowers for it, because as a junior, you had to learn all those basics, and you knew that you were going to cross over to an adult, right? So as a juniors that you taught coming out as an adult, you also evolved. And I believe being the best instructor is also being a student as well. So you learn from your students. Like the more you vocalize, as you know, through not only just a coach, but also a private instructor, is the more you vocalize, those students watch you. They actually become more analytic towards your movement because they already know it and they already can do it. So they actually create the new version 3, version 4 of Jackson Rudolph.
Absolutely. And that's one thing that I think that any good coach hopes, right? Is you hope that your students will go on and create something beyond what you've already done. So speaking about creating beyond things done before, trying to segue this here, are there any other tricks that you were the first person doing competition? Was 720 the pinnacle of it, or were there any others that had the Carmichael Simon stamp that you were the first person to do it in a form?
No, I mean, the only other contribution I would say is the blueprint. And I call it the blueprint. Obviously, we wrote about that in the on the blog, is the format, the 4-sectional format that actually evolved from Wushu, right? To make sure that there is a hand section at the beginning, a good tricking pass, the third sectional corner side, and then closing off with a hand section or big, section and a big jump kick of some sort, or acro kick. So that format has been around since the mid 90s. And no, because remember, forms were not choreographed in that way, or, it was very, some were diagonal like Charlie Lee. Some were, forward facing like a Jean Fournette, or you had a Wushu set, 4 sections like a Ho Sung Pak, Richard Branding, Keith Harbayashi. But, having our own format, and I believe it also transitions to weapons as well, is we've developed our own style, our own discipline. And that's what's so prominent about sport karate, because I believe it's its own style, because it has its own discipline, and it has its own philosophy, and it has its own conditioning and training regimens. So that's where, that third contribution of the sport has provided.
I couldn't agree more. I think you're spot on with that. And you mentioned the influence of your Kung Fu training on the way that you created that blueprint. Now, I haven't seen footage of this. I don't know if there is footage, but I've heard the stories of a time when you ran a form wearing a uniform that was custom made, half Kung Fu uniform, half hardstyle karate uniform. Tell us that story. Where did you get that idea, and what was that moment?
That was Charlie Lee's idea. 1990, I was already training both styles. This is my first year out. So I fortunately won the battle my first year out. And, continue on, obviously, Mike would win, John would win. And Charlie always told me it is very difficult to win at Capital Classics. It's just one of those things that if you're a hometown hero, it's difficult to win in your town. And he goes, but I think you should do Wushu because this is a Kung Fu audience as well, and they'll appreciate your talent. And these are the judges, the coaches, the families that have watched you grow since 1986, for example. And so we did half Mozart, Figaro, and then funny enough, it was MC Hammer, You Can't Touch This. And he said, okay, what we're going to do is I'm going to mix your music, and you have a Wushu set. I just need 2 sections. We're going to do half of your hard style, and at the middle of the form, you're going to break and you're going to do Wushu. And that was one thing, because it was about, Charlie helped me become a performer, and he allowed me to be a performer. But he also embraced the other disciplines and styles that I learned. And he knew that the platforms that were given in the right environment was going to help transcend the sport. And that is the story. It was choreographed by him. And it was another great moment. And I believe you can watch it. It is, I think it's a 1991 or 90 Diamonds footage. Right. And if not, I will definitely send you the link. But it was a great moment as well. And, to be able to fuse it only helped me adapt more of this blueprint, because I didn't know the blueprint at the time in 1990, because I don't believe we really had one until the mid 90s.
Right. And the creativity of that, the joint effort of yourself and Charlie Lee to create that entire idea of like a half kung fu, half sport karate form is just like mind-boggling how cool that is. And I know that throughout your career, you had some other great moments similar to that in ways where the performance of the routine all the way down to the uniform and I guess the costume, if you will, had an impact, right? Are there any others that stick out to you? Maybe just some brief highlights of some of your favorite, more, I guess unique is the right word for it, performances.
No, I think what I remember during the time was more of the amenities. And when I say amenities, like the accessories, it was, doing like these little B12 shots to get my energy up, wetting my hair, putting wrist wraps on, I remember, things like getting my stone-washed Century uniform, the Chuck Norris one, right? It's like I always wanted to look like Charlie Lee or Stephen Ho. So it's like you could only buy that uniform because I didn't have a uniform that was as old at the time, right? Or worn out, I should say. So those are some of the highlights that I do remember. I was not like Kim Do. I remember Kim Do used to come in with sequence uniforms, and amazing costumes. However, for myself, it was, the basic traditional forms. But most importantly, once I put that John Paul Mitchell jacket on and Mike passed his jacket over to me, that was it. It was just like you right now. I was like, got to rep the brand and maintain the respect and integrity of this legacy.
For sure. No, I couldn't agree more. And so of all those performances that you referenced, do you have a favorite? Like what's the one that you were like, that was peak? Would that be Bluegrass 95 or is there another one?
Bluegrass was great. The Crow, 94.
Ooh,
Brandon Lee recently passed at the time. And, was it right before Halloween, right? So, Stone Temple Pilots mixed the music, put the face paint on and stepped in the Diamond Nationals and provided my last junior performance to the crowd with the Crow. So that was pretty fun. I did have the opportunity to share that footage with Miss Linda Lee, and she really appreciated it. This was during Grandmaster Rhee's passing, and she did really appreciate, paying homage and a tribute to her late great son. So that was very heartwarming as well, knowing I was able to take that opportunity. And that's the thing with competitors is if you have the opportunity, don't fear your failure. Embrace the failure and do it because there's not going to be a moment like that again. So take the opportunity, win, lose, or draw. You tried it, and that's all that matters. Absolutely. And the fact that it was documented and I was able to share it is you're going to have generations that are going to look back at the footage and always appreciate it for what it was at that time. And, flashes, crashes without basics is a great motto. Well, one that I always live with from Charlie Lee is it's better to be a has-been than a never was.
Absolutely. I like that one a lot too.
Right?
And so the Crow form you bring up, that's one thing. There's been a few moments in sport karate history where tribute forms have happened. And those are always like some of the most special forms, especially to that individual competitor, right? I remember like in my generation coming up when I was a junior looking at the adult division, Kalman did two of them, right? Kalman did, everybody remembers the one after Kalman's dad passed away. That was a tribute form to his father. That was 2010 Diamonds, I believe, which I believe was better than his blindfolded double sword form. Like if you look at the year before that, the tribute form to his dad was just insane. And then what most people don't know is that Kalman also ran a Kevin Thompson tribute form before anybody knew that he had ALS. When Kevin retired before his diagnosis, he retired at the Ocean States, the Paul Mitchell home tournament. And at the Ocean States where Kevin retired, Kalman did a Kevin Thompson tribute form at that Ocean States. And Kalman doing that when Kevin retired, and then the relationship that I would, grow with Kevin over the years as I was on stage at the Ocean States and got to know Kevin more as a team captain, right? that would ultimately be what inspired me to do, you know, a Kevin Thompson tribute performance at the Ocean States, which would wind up being the last form that he saw me run while he was still with us, which is something that's just so special. And so that's one thing I want the audience to understand, is that, like, it's not necessarily always the biggest win or the hardest thing you did. Sometimes it's the forms that you do that mean something to you, regardless of what anything outside meant. The form itself and what that meant to you and the person that you were doing it to show respect for, that's more special than almost anything else. Any thoughts on that before we move on?
I absolutely. And then, you know, watching, you know, Atlantic and Trans World Team, I remember watching these legends perform. I remember watching Kevin Thompson perform, and just to know that I was able to share a stage with him and compete against him, or wear the same jacket as he did. It's sort of like wearing the Masters green jacket. Like, that's what it really means to us. So that is the pinnacle of athletes at a high level. But most importantly is knowing that the memories that our late greats, mentors and masters had the opportunity to watch us evolve and to pay homage and tributes to them before they move on to, you know, another life is beautiful. And you know, I remember being there as well, and it was beautiful. You know, I'm gonna deeply miss Kevin, always do. And it's just one of those, you know, unprecedented circumstances that I feel that he was able to give everything to us, you know, to know that this man also beat Charlie Lee in Bermuda. You know, I remember reading magazines of when he was just coming up, but I also watched him point fight the best. You know, I just didn't know you could triple crown the way that he triple crowned. Like, people remember, you know, the most recent triple crowns or the Mike Bernardo triple crowns and these great athletes. However, this was what Kevin Thompson was known for. He is the triple crown pioneer, because everybody else was either doing forms and weapons or, you know, forms and fighting. But to be a master at all three was something that we all to this day achieve to be.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more. And an excellent testimony on behalf of Kevin Thompson there. In my opinion, the greatest all-around sport karate competitor of all time, because of what he could do winning those triple crowns. And a lot of people often forget this. He did it for nearly 4 decades. Like, he did it when he was in his prime in his 20s, and then he did it in the senior division as recently as the late 2000s. In the late 2000s, in the 30-plus, 40-plus division, Kevin Thompson was winning triple crown senior grands in forms, weapons, and fighting even then. Like, he did this for the better part of 4 decades, which is insane. But now we're gonna get back on the path we were going down here. So your competitive success, doing the 720 at the Battle of Atlanta, getting the recognition of WMAC Masters, gave you that opportunity to play Kid Carmichael. So I want you to talk a little bit, not just about how cool being Kid Carmichael was, but also being on set surrounded by not just sport karate legends, because there were a bunch of them, martial arts legends. Olympic gold medalist Herb Perez played Olympus, and it wasn't just sport karate. It was so many amazing martial artists, all-time great martial artists. Just tell us a little bit about that experience in general.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll start with when I was 16 and I went to watch Stephen Ho and Ernie Jr. film film Ninja Turtles 2 in North Carolina. And that's when I first met Pat Johnson. And he knew me from competition. And he actually wanted to, at the time, bring me into film as a foot soldiers and, you know, be part of the cast. But I was too young. There was no budget at the time to bring, you know, we're not homeschooling. So, you know, I had to go to school. They didn't have that type of budget at the time. So that was my first visual to entertainment, and knowing that that could become, you know, my life. Now, fast forward to WMAC Masters. Yes. I mean, being the kid, you know, and being the youngest one on set, they embraced me. They shared with me their testimonies of life as a competitor, as coaches, and how to conduct myself, not just as a martial artist, but also as a man. This is very young at the time. So, you know, I was very influenced by all of them, and they shared with me their styles and their disciplines. And I knew later in life, knowing that this conversation would eventually happen, was I knew I'd be a representation of that time, and it's very surreal. And it was during a time when all these great competitors were at the height of their careers. And for them to know that I was that next generation is pretty synonymous to my time with you. Is you see certain talent that go through the journey of martial arts, and you respect them because they know, and I know, for example, what you've gone through as a competitor. They knew what I went through as a competitor to get to this point. So that is passing the torch, or they would say passing the mic. You know, this generation thinks about dropping the mic, let's go, whatever. No, pass the mic, hold on to it. It's going to be heavy for a while. Speak, articulate, continue to provide back to the community and to our next generations. And that was really what I received from WMAC Masters. Was the World Martial Arts Council was a virtual television show that we are living now. That's, it's just, syndication is one thing, but having these type of platforms to share it, but also know that there's a generation that you're leading. The council is great. It has just expanded globally. And that's what I really enjoy.
And that is an excellent message. So cool. And I got to ask, are there any, so that overall experience is obviously the most influential and impactful thing, but just for our audience that wants to know, that's fans of all these great sport karate competitors, right? Were there any moments on set? Are there any stories that just like seeing somebody training with somebody, or just like something really cool that you saw while on set? Maybe one or two memories?
Oh, absolutely. One would be paddle kicking correctly. So there's Herb Perez had another teammate, Clayton Barber, Hollywood. He's actually a stunt coordinator as well. An amazing coordinator as well. He's still in the business, but he's the one that showed me jackknife and switchblade, 540, hook round hook, or 540 hook. But I mean, this was standing still, holding paddles. So what we're seeing now from the Kukiwan and the breaking, I was able to see this from the elite Olympic style competitors at the time coming out of 88. So these guys were phenomenally fast, phenomenally powerful. And I will always remember those times, because it would be, for example, myself, Pedro, and Clayton. Pedro Xavier, obviously teammate, kicking paddles. And I just remember enjoying learning how to acro kick properly. Because remember, I'm coming out of a Wushu, slap front kick, inside crescent, outside crescent kicks, or butterfly twists or butterflies, etc. But to be able to now utilize my kicking ability from the hips down, not just simple rotation, really showed me that next generation of body mechanics. And that's what always will stick with me. I think the other part of it is Hakeem. Hakeem was always been my mentor. Hakeem has always embraced me, even as a junior. And to watch him orchestrate WMAC Masters, because as the lead character, how he's articulated in the show, the storyline is really the pure representation, per se, of Hakeem. He's a great man. He's a great mentor. And I'm just very fortunate to call him my older brother. So those are probably the most two influential pieces. One's very objective, kicking wise. One's very subjective. That's been able to allow me to carry my relationship for decades and decades to come.
Absolutely. I feel like I'm saying just that's so cool over and over again. You're listening to this, just like geeking out over all this stuff, because these are the people who I've watched, whether it's point fighters and watching their fighting tapes, or forms and weapons competitors and watching their performances. It's who I've watched for years and years and years as I was coming up through my career. And so you had WMAC Masters. You also spoke about being on tour with the Mortal Kombat Live tour during that 1995 season, which is insane, playing Liu Kang, which is an iconic character, of course. So tell us a little bit about that experience too.
Yes. So right after Masters, there was auditions at Radio City Music Hall. Gary Wall, the late great Gary Wall, and John Valera and I went to New York City to obviously audition for Mortal Kombat. Pat Johnson at the time obviously was the coordinator, and we got selected to be part of the show and went to the Catskill Mountains where Mike Tyson used to train at a resort. And we trained for the summer and we did Radio City Music Hall that fall. I think of the fall of 94, 95, one of those years. And we did 8 shows that weekend. And from there, we jumped on a tour bus in 95. Yeah, okay, 95, I believe. And we did the entire United States from Radio City Music Hall to the LA Forum. And I would say one of the biggest shows I did, quite honestly, was the LA Forum at the time, about 20, I don't know, maybe 15, 20,000 of basketball fans for the halftime show for the LA Lakers. So that was pretty cool. I'm sitting there in the back, in the locker room, and there's Magic Johnson walking through. It's just really, you just, you think you see it in television, but when you step next to a basketball player and you think Hakeem's already tall, right? But you see this next generation of like professional athletes, it gives you a different perspective. But that all actually led up to that show. Actually, was not the prior show that was as big was actually the Buddha Gala. So I was out in Italy and Fawako, Ennio Falzoni, I believe, and went with Master Nick Serio, who else was with me, and Rocky DeRico. So we went out there to Italy and we did a 10-day tour from Milan to Rome. And we went through all these, Sardinia, we went through all these towns and performed and showcased. And one of the places we did was an arena of about 10,000, and it's interesting, as it's like, you step on stage and you sort of, one or two things happen. You not just black out, not in a negative way, but when you're performing, you actually, you also visualize the mirror. Even though there's 10,000 people around you, you always remember how to move. And there's always this reflection of yourself, even though you'll never see yourself live perform, right? But you do it and then you're done and you're like, wow, that wasn't as bad as one would think, right? Because you can really psych yourself out. Or one could psych themselves out if they're not an elite performer to step in on a stage by yourself, front and center in front of 10,000, 20,000, right? So you can, you understand that level. And it's, to know that being a representative for the United States, being a representative to our sport karate community, being a representative to martial arts and media. But most importantly, I would say those are the 3 amazing pieces, but the one that surpasses them all is going to Russia with Grandmaster Jhoon Rhee. During the time when there was the Soviet Union was collapsing in the early 90s, and we brought martial arts ballet to Russia. And you can only imagine during a time when the Soviet Union is now a democracy as a Russian Union, and they're doing, God Bless America, Star Spangled Banner, right? It's, we're taking national anthems of martial arts choreography into the former Soviet Union. So, and that was a great time as well, being with Grandmaster Rhee and spending as much time as I had philosophically speaking with him, and, being able to be one of, quote unquote, one of his direct lineages will always be front and center. Because remember, I'm coming from 1989 when I first seen Exodus and Charlie Lee perform his musical form, to now being with Grandmaster Rhee in Russia, and bringing diplomacy throughout the world.
And that is the perfect transition. All those incredible performances in front of tens of thousands and being in, the forum in LA, which is so cool. One performance that I feel like to you probably might mean more than any of them is you had the opportunity in some of Grandmaster Rhee's final days to perform martial arts ballet for him, Exodus and all of some of his favorites, right? Yes. So tell us about how surreal that was and what that meant to you.
Yes, so I was very fortunate to get the phone call from Master Panita during the time when Grandmaster Rhee was in hospice care at the time, and Grandmaster Rhee wanted to promote me, and he wanted to see me. So I prepared for a few weeks to make sure that my choreography was on par, and we went to see him, and I had to perform curriculum in 20 minutes. So, for one, it was very emotional because I'm performing in front of not just the grandmaster of sport karate per se or our industry, but the grandmaster who has unified Korea, Russia, and the United States through martial ballet. And to look deeply in his eyes, to perform Exodus, to perform Granada, to perform God Bless America, the Star Spangled Banner, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And these are iconic, known forms that will always be part of not past history, but the generations to come. And to know this is where we are now, at that time, it was, like I said, very emotional. And quite honestly, internally, I was crying. I mean, I probably shed a few tears, knowing the point at where he was physically. However, I knew what he gave to me as his student, as one of as the last master, was his soul, the mental comprehension of the seven qualities of a champion, leading by example, action philosophy, as well as his emotional piece of him is the contribution back to the community through business, the contribution to products and services of, not just brand appeal, but what is the purpose, what is the function of the value that we need to give back to the industry. And then most importantly now is his spirit will always live. I'm just a physical manifestation of what he's taught to me through this time, and a representation of all my masters that he contributed to their success as well. So with that, it's I adore the man, as you all know, and knowing what he's given to our community and what he's given through all of our organizations will always stand the test of time. It's very timeless. All of it is timeless.
I couldn't agree more. And once again, a beautiful testimony to truly one of the greatest and most influential martial artists, period, of all time, Grandmaster Jhoon Rhee. And, just to summarize some of his other contributions, the initial martial arts ballet is one thing, but that was the original choreography of martial arts to music, period. The invention of sparring gear, protective sparring gear that we see all the time in point fighting today. It's mandated by most leagues, right? Teaching business seminars. You mentioned helping schools become successful. He didn't just teach martial arts seminars. Grandmaster Rhee taught business seminars that helped other schools get their start so that martial arts could become widespread throughout America. And that lasting impact will be felt forever in the martial arts community. And as we talk about forever, of course, we move on into the modern era and then looking forward to the future. And although it's a tough transition to go from Grandmaster Jhoon Rhee to now talking about today's martial arts, but that's what we got to do to get to the end of the show today. And let's start with a positive spin on this, because we're going to look at both sides and see what are some of the good, what are some of the bad of modern, particularly creative, musical, and extreme performance. Because traditional, it definitely evolves over the years and it does its thing, but that is, it's quite evident that in today's times, it's very separate from the creative, musical, and extreme evolution. So what would you say if you had to pick 2 or 3 of your favorite things? What do you like about today's creative, musical, and extreme competition?
No, what I enjoy is the athleticism. There's a reason why we call our school martial athletes. It's like our sport is becoming a lifestyle. It's becoming a lifestyle brand. There's a lot of curriculums out there that provide the opportunity for schools to teach what we do. I really enjoy that, because it now not only becomes this small confined circuit of 10 top athletes, and the other 90 are supportive cast per se, because I feel like it's like a tour. Now it's becoming an opportunity for multiple streams of opportunities for other schools to understand what we do as a culture, the sport karate culture. I believe the training regiments have evolved, which is great. I remember when Mike Chat first brought out XMA. I'm watching, from your flow. There's new programs building from there, right? And it's giving these opportunities for individuals like yourself to be able to broaden the education and opportunities of martial arts. And I know it comes in very physically at first, but the objective, short-term, long-term goals, and hopefully from that black belt, they have the mentality and the mindset of a martial artist, right? It's sort of like a Tony Robbins, right? Tony Robbins did his 6 weeks with Grandmaster Rhee, and it shifted his mindset to become a Jhoon Rhee black belt. Not saying that one would always agree that 6 weeks is the right path, but if you actually count the hours that they trained, that's about the same amount of hours that you would do for a 36-month curriculum, for example. Now, but you're taking Tony Robbins, so it's just a different situation. Right. That's what I do love about it. And second is what is difficult is the uniqueness. I think we've always spoken about the uniqueness. The robot scenario, we understand, because you have to learn your technique. But there's this style missing, because if you want to deliver properly, if you deliver the same box over and over, we're not Amazon. It's not the same thing, right? So we're not distributing in that way. It is individual characters who learn martial arts techniques. They understand the philosophy, the style, but they deliver differently through their body dynamics. And I always look at a challenge or an issue as an opportunity. And I would say that is the opportunity of the sport, is not always expanding. What I mean by expanding divisions is fine, because you have more opportunities during the time that you're at the tournament, but you need to expand your choreography. You have to push yourself and grow through the discipline. And that's what I feel is at times missing, because we're so set as a sport to perfect the art or perfect a lineage, but it's also the opportunity to evolve it with the basics. Because now we went from a generation as flash, too much flash, no basics. Now we have basics and flash. But there's got to be a level that both of those move at the same level now, because we're educated enough as a community. And there's not a dichotomy of it once was, stylistic divisions like you were talking about earlier in the 90s. Everybody's playing the same game. We're doing the same sport. And quite honestly, it's not about the judges always too. It's really the same judges. Like, our parents, as you know, they might not be black belts, but they know what looks bad. They've been around long enough. Like, what doesn't look good or bad. Even the normal consumer, even though they might not understand martial arts, they know what's appealing to the eye. But I would also say this is we have 5 senses, and primarily you want to, utilize, 3 of those per se is, the touch, the visual, and the acoustic part of martial arts. And that's why I always believe the musical part of it. I hope in the generations to come that we go back to full choreography, musical pieces, and things that the consumer who does not understand martial arts has the opportunity to embrace what we do, which is really sport karate or sport martial arts.
Yes. I love that. And I love, in particular, the positive aspect that you talked about, because I think that's an underrated one, how CMX, creating musical extreme performances in general, and that style of martial arts, because it is its own style of martial arts now, can really benefit retention within the schools, right? So many kids start martial arts because they saw a Marvel movie and they want to be a superhero, right? And then they go into a martial arts school to sign up and take classes. And then they realize very quickly, this isn't what Superman did, or this isn't what Captain America did, right? But if you have sport karate, who are the stunt men and women that are in those movies? Sport karate world champions that have moved on to the stunt industry in many cases, right?
That's
And
right.
so if you're teaching a sport karate curriculum, and let's say that your basic part is chop punch, and then maybe you throw in a Superman punch, all of a sudden that kid is like, oh, this is a week into classes. They're like, oh, this is what I wanted to learn. And it's going to keep kids coming back. So I think that is a very important part of modern creative musical extreme competition, and that style of sport martial arts being used in the school to keep kids coming back. And then I also love that negative side that you mentioned, is that so often it feels like today forms and weapons divisions become an arms race, right? And we've seen in recent memory the highest level extreme forms competitors in the world, instead of doing what, like for example, right? If Mike Chat did backflips and upgraded his multiple kicking combo, Carmichael and John Valera were not going to do a backflip and then do a multiple kicking combo. They were going to do what they were best at in an effort to try to defeat the other style, right? And so, today we see, oh, well, you did 5 gainer switches and then a cork. Well, I'm going to do 6 gainer switches and then a double cork. And it looks the same, instead of, and especially to the consumer who were trying to pitch sport karate to, sport martial arts to the consumer, all of those things look the same. Whether it was 4 or 5 or a single or double, it all looks the same to them. But if competitors would start kind of capturing their own style and using that style to make them successful, and as you mentioned, that is predicated upon the mastery of the basics, that is how the sport can move forward. So 2 final questions, just out of curiosity. We'll do them one at a time.
You mind if I interject real quick?
Go ahead, absolutely.
Okay. So remember, we talked about Grandmaster Rhee in martial arts, ballet, and business. And we talked about Charlie Lee and the evolution of competition and, competition platforms and, what he's contributed. If you think about who my peers were, right? John Valera and Mike Chat. Anybody who's listening to this, always refer back to XMA, because that is the initial sport karate curriculum. And that is what, if you go to Hollywood and that's what you want to do as an entertainer, they will ask you, do you do XMA as one of the type of styles for film? Now, remember we were talking about media earlier, about the generation of Mike, John, and I being inspired by Stephen Ho, right? And going to do all this film stuff. You have to look up 8711. So if you look at 8711, John became that sport karate individual who contributed to the industry. And those are the 2 that move into the opportunities that were not provided to us. So we had to build the platforms and foundation. Then you're looking at the 2000 history of Anish Sherfa, Danny Graham, Matt Emig, Sammy Vasquez, Mark Canonizado, Rudy Raynon. Like, this was another Steve Tirada, another generation, David Douglas, right? This is like early 2000s, tricking competitions are happening. But look what this last 2010 decade to now. These are all the competitors, but there was not the work efforts of Mike Chat for XMA or John Valera in 8711. The opportunities that are happening now, when you were saying Marvel, or when you're saying being able to learn our type of curriculum, would not have happened with those 2 gentlemen as well. Right. And that's our path. And all the processes, this is exactly as well what John, Mike, and I as kids always imagined. So I love them just like they're my brothers. They're my nemesis in competition. However, to give back to the community, they have done their due diligence to provide the platforms for us as a martial arts and the sport karate community to have this as a lifestyle, not just having a martial arts school to sell sparring equipment. Right. It is transcended so beyond in the last 50 years. But without grandmastery, that foundation would not have happened.
And that's something I love about your generation of competitors, is that each of you did something following your sport karate career that elevated the sport. Not just your competition within the sport elevated it, but the steps that all of you took after retiring from competition continued to improve the sport and make it better and better. And that is something that in recent memory we haven't seen as much of, right? We've seen adult competitors retire and face the, oh wait, I didn't go to college, what now, right? We've seen, and there's nothing wrong with being an adult competitor that goes and opens a karate school. That's great, because that's going to provide for your family and that's going to change the lives of all the students that come into that school. However, with what we are specifically talking about with elevating sport karate and giving back to the sport after it has been retired from, that is something that has been missing compared to what yourself and Valera and Chat have been able to do, among others, over the past, decades since you guys have retired. And you're killing it with the segues today. So bringing up those 2000 competitors from the 2000s, that's the perfect transition into one of the questions that I was most intrigued by when we were preparing for this podcast. And that is, yourself, Valera, Chat, the great triumvirate, as I call it, had all retired by the turn of the century, right? Retired from competition. And there was this new era of martial arts competitors, right? You've mentioned Imig and Terada and Reynon and Canonizado and Daniel Sterling, and I'm leaving people out. So many that have been great extreme forms competitors from the year 2000 up until right now, the year 2021. In your opinion, who is the best out of the past 20 years? And if that's too hard, maybe a top three.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to backtrack as I'm processing. That's a great question. You said a word, transition. And one thing that I was always able to master in martial arts was the transition. Because even though you learn your sections, how do you move through your sections? It kind of goes back to your bow piece. When you're moving through your bow and things are not moving a certain direction, it moves the transition a different way and doesn't feel right. Always go with understanding the transition. Martial arts competition is about the transition through the sections. It is not the section that you develop. Now, moving forward, Steve Terada, Rudy Reynon, Matt Emig.
In no particular order, or is that?
No particular order. I just want to think back of the contribution. Just because during a time when I saw Steve Terada, he was training with Arnold Chan, and he was amazing laid back 540. Mm-hmm. Not very flexible, but was able to use flexibility like a Charlie Lee. Like Charlie was unable to kick over his waist pretty much. Right? but he's got the most solid side kicks you'd ever see, and he can fly. So you got to use that. But to be able to utilize martial arts discipline and become one of the top, or an only martial artist per se in Quest Crew, and to win America's Best Dance Crew in a different genre of movement, claps all around. Mm-hmm. One. Rudy Reynon. Transitioning, the crossover was very important for him, which was going from a junior being developed by John Valera and having the already expectations to be the best is already pressure. Now you're wearing a Valera for one, then you're attempting to transition into an adult. But at the same time, to be relevant for what he did in a high-end tricking community in California with loop kicks, to go back to NASCA and to bridge two communities together that were never bridged. Like we're talking about NASCA kids going to loop kicks. They would never hang out. And bring commas to the inspirations of the later likenesses of a Tyler Weaver, for example, right? Like you have to see what this individual did.
Yes.
Now, most recently, you think about what he's done in the musical industry. everything that he's learned, choreographed through martial arts, has now mentally, you can hear sound and sound bites of martial arts through the music that he's made. So that tells me this isn't just about sport karate. Sport karate is in music. Sport karate is in dance. Now here's the kicker. Is Matt Emig. And I say Matt Emig is because you can look at him as the protege of Chuck's per se. But his tricking sequences with his acro kicking and tricking are phenomenal. Like it's borderline watching an ice skater do quad lutzes and quad folds in place.
Yes.
Right? Like Wushu stylists have to run to gain momentum. Matt Emig does not gain momentum. He's been able to, that's 7 qualities of a champion. Even when I saw him as a junior at Charlie Lee Nationals, like I knew he was going to be one of the next. Now, to now be embraced by 8711, to now be with John Valera, you know, and to be able to contribute back into, once again, the film industry is something as well. And I say those 3 more specifically. I'll extend it to Mark Canonizato, the kicker of the circuit, who took kicking with tricking. Like I'm saying ground kicking, not jump kicking, ground kicking to tricking, like to now work for another, I would say, quote unquote, no pun intended, hero, is Hiro Koda, right? You know, is Karate Kid, right? And we'll see him, you know, to be working with a former Metro All-Star teammate. It just shares with you that our roots are so deep, you know, and the integrity and authenticity is so deep. But it's also those gentlemen are not where they're at because of just the flash that everybody sees. They see it because they were mentored by the individuals who had basics.
Mm-hmm. That is an excellent top 3. Anybody watching this in the comments, give me your top 3, 2000 through 2021, top 3 extreme forms competitors. And that sparks one more thing that I want to touch on, because I know you are the right person to answer this question. And one of the popular like sports trends right now is like, what's a hill that you will die on? And this is a hill that I will die on, right? Because I love that top 3. Terada, Reynon, and Emig in any order that you want to put them in, right? I've always said that Emig was the best of that generation, but I can see arguments all around, right? And I've had students that I tell about Terada and Reynon in particular, and even Matt, right? And I'm going to bring up 3 specific examples of things that I have shown to my students through YouTube videos, and they're like, wait, but he does this. Isn't that bad? So here's the thing, right? You look at Matt's punching. Often on a higher angle, often not on the typical angle that we would see punches, right? That's one of the more minor ones, because by most modern standards, Matt's stances and everything else were spot on, right? Rudy, we look at Rudy's front stances, the back leg was consistently bent, but it didn't matter. It was almost part of Rudy. It was part of his style. It was almost like, especially with his kamas, his foot position and the way that he got into his stance, where it was at times almost just a lunge, almost made the kama cuts more aggressive, which is something that nobody has replicated since Rudy, right? And then you look at Terada, and often because of the way that he would go into his trick combos, his stances were consistently higher, right? His stances were consistently higher, but it also fit the way in which he performed, right? And I talk about this a lot with bow striking as well. It's like you look at bow staff striking in the 90s, by today's standards, it wasn't clean, right? And you look at all-time great bow staff competitors and you say, by today's standards, they didn't extend any of those strikes. But that was the standard of technique back then. And if it matched the style, that made it work. That is a hill that I will die on. I just want your response to that real briefly before we wrap things up.
I'm going to reframe it, because my answer was based on industry. Now, competitor-wise, Kamanchoka.
Ooh, okay.
And I say that because I remember him as a junior. I remember he's got a lot of shoes to fill to get to the point that when he transformed the circuit as a competitor. So that's one. Now, the Batman to his Robin to his Batman is Marcel Jones.
Right.
Like, but you also have a byproduct of Austin Crane. So I think about that decade, right? But I'm talking about Empty Hand. Now, when I think about the virtual part of all this, if I look at 2010 and to now, it's going to be two major competitors. It's not even Forms competitors. It's yourself and Reed. And the reason why is because at certain intervals, Empty Hand and tricking was the norm. Like chucking was cool, commas were cool, but you still remembered their choreography. Like it moved from the 90s choreography into the 2000s. They incorporated major tricking maneuvers. But what didn't happen until you two came onto the scene was utilizing that into the weapons, which has never been seen. I can't even, I'm unable to place a style or an individual who did weapons tricks, not even to your caliber. I'm just saying in general, like imagined it. I don't know. I'm thinking about the 80s. I think about the 90s. I think about the 2000 era. No one, you and Reed are you guys are it. And then now with the media piece of that is what you guys can continue to contribute within your association, as well as, your career here with Black Belt. So that is that next piece. And I have to give, like I said, props, kudos, and flowers to you guys, because I say the three because I recall how the transition of the entertainment field actually manifested. But you guys had to take it to the Marvel level. And that's what you guys have done.
First and foremost, thank you. That means a ton coming from you, and I really do deeply appreciate that. And that's something, because you bring up me and Reed in the same breath. If you look at the weapons division over the years, you need the rival, right? The previous generation, there was Matt and Kalman. Before Kalman did double sword, it was Matt's chucks and Mark's commas, right? You go back, look at the women's division. For years, you had Caitlin and Becca. And then you had Caitlin and Audrey at the end of Caitlin's career, Audrey Donahue, another disciple of Kalman Choka. Before that, you had an incredible moment in sport karate history when it was Lauren and Casey, teacher and student, right? Extremely similar styles going head to head, right? And so throughout the history of the weapons division, there's been, like you had the triumvirate back in the day, there has been head-to-head rivalry matchups the entire time all the way through that has helped elevate that. And that's why I teach all of my students, you have to respect your competitors, because your future legacy will not be built without beating another legend. Without beating somebody else who was great, you won't be able to be great yourself. And so you need each other for that to be sustained. And so I absolutely love that take. And thank you again so much.
Absolutely.
Including
it means the world. Now, dying on the hill with you. Yeah. Yes. And yeah, you're right. I mean, the details are there, and to be perfectionists as we are as competitors, athletes, we will always see those nuances. But I think there's a part where we kind of forgive it because of body dynamic, because of the evolution of the techniques they're attempting to throw or attempting to compensate for to make it. And I think that's another part about competition we spoke about before is, the compensating for technique does not mean forgetting about all the aspects of executing it. And sometimes, when competitors go out there, they'll rather throw the trick than maintain solid basics. And even if they don't even jump very high or levitate, the fact that they feel as though they can throw a raise or a gainer or a cork, it doesn't help you to win ultimately if everybody's doing it, right? So with that, yes, I do agree with regards to the back leg unlocked or the Mark Canonizado side kick not chambering fully, or like you said, the punch, to the nose level. Because I remember even starting sport karate, and all that was shared with me. And one thing that's really interesting is one would say punching to the nose or the face is how you're technically supposed to learn. But for sport karate, it's actually about lines. So you actually, this is not a proper technique to punch to the line, because you would never punch somebody to the shoulder or to the chest
Right.
in a fight. But knowing and forgiving it's sport karate, you accept it. So going back to your statement with the others, if you're going to throw a side kick and not chamber because you have to throw a gainer right out of it, I'm going to have to give it to athleticism because we're doing sport karate. If you're doing, your commas, and your back leg is unlocked because you are moving at 160 beats a minute, I'm going to forgive that.
Absolutely.
But it's also going back to what we've talked about, technique, style, and the delivery of it. And people only remember the delivery. And we can have the conversations about the technique is off. Oh, I don't like this style. But ultimately, it's the performer delivering the artwork.
Yes.
Right? And that is the creation that actually sport karate allows. The openness is we all have the opportunity to create. So competition-wise, that is why the platforms of competition, open style competitions are there, because we want to see the creativity. We do not want to see robotics. We can go watch a different style or a different art form, right? And that's where dance is elevated, because they have been able to move different types of movement and styles together. I mean, it's not just ballet and jazz and tap. It's, lyrical, hip hop, and, crumping and all this and all. I mean, there's so much different disciplines in dance now that's how I see sport karate and tricking and everything that we do.
Absolutely. And I believe that is an excellent take-home message. Carmichael, thank you so much for your time today. This has been an incredible show. We didn't expect a 2-hour show, but hey, this is what you guys get. We get a 2-hour show, and I had a feeling that we could probably dive in and go this deep on some of these questions. So genuinely, thank you so much for your time. Our audience, thank you so much for tuning in. I always say this, but if you're tuning in at the end of this episode, you got to rewind this thing. You got to rewind this stream. Go back and on this episode, I'll probably put in some timestamps of some of the key moments, so that if you're looking for a specific topic, you can go in and find it. So look out for that in the description, whether you're on Facebook or you're watching with us on YouTube. Be sure to check that out. So thank you to everybody tuning in. Thank you to Black Belt Magazine for hosting yet another episode of the Jackson Rudolph Podcast. This has been episode 65. Thank you once again, Carmichael. This has been awesome, and I will see you guys next week.